So we've seen lots of ways to do that last example. And in fact, there's 5 different versions. Examples 12 to 16 all do exactly the same thing. If you put the same input in, you'll get the same output out. Just they choose to do it in different ways. So if you notice, we had 12 was the nested ifs. We could use the AND operator. We've used OR operators. We've used Booleans to express whether they're senior or child, and we use the NOT operator. All different ways of doing the same thing. There's no one correct version. Okay, in the end, you have to decide as a programmer which is the one that you find easiest to understand, or perhaps which is most elegant. Sometimes it comes down to that choice, and that's why programming is sometimes described as an art rather than a science. My preferred version is version 14, but you may disagree with that. So version 14 is this one here. So my preferred version, we check whether they're a student and their age is between, so under 18 or over 65, and if both of those conditions aren't true, then we check whether they're a student. Either one of those conditions is true. Okay, and if none of those things are true, if none of those conditions are true, then we say then they have to pay the regular price. It does have duplication in the sense that we have to do this. We're doing this check on their age twice, and duplication is always best to be avoided. But I find this the easiest one to read, because I can look at the operators there and look at the code and understand it fairly easily. Obviously, you may have different ideas, but ideally, whichever version you prefer, you should know how to code all of those versions if you were required to, or at the very least understand how each of them works. So try and get the hang of this idea of AND operators, OR operators, and NOT operators, and doing these numerical comparisons. Okay, one other thing I'm going to mention, and we saw this earlier on in the lecture, is the idea of what's called validation. So I haven't mentioned the word before, but we saw that when the user typed in yes with different capitalization, we found a way of dealing with that. Validation is just refers, usually in programming terms, just refers to checking the user input, make sure that what the user has inputted makes sense. So, for example, if you were asking for a phone number, you might check it had the right number of digits. If you're asking for an email address, you might check it's got an @ symbol or and some dots in the second half of the address. When we did the YES one, we just checked. We checked whether it was we checked to ignore the case of what the user typed in, so they could use capitals or lowercase. Validation is checking that the user's input it makes sense. We had an example from the last topic where we asked the user whether for their maximum and minimum value, and and then we gave them some random numbers based on that. But you may have noticed, or perhaps didn't, but if you tried it with the minimum value bigger than the maximum, or the other way around, the maximum less than the minimum, you'll get an error. We can actually try that. By the way, I think that is now called 15, not 14. Let's just run it. Random values. So if I run this one, if I say minimum is 1 and 10, I get numbers between 1 and 10. Okay. If I say minimum is 10, but the maximum is 1, then obviously the minimum is bigger than the maximum. I get an error. I don't know if you saw that, it just disappeared. The window disappeared. As I mentioned when we were doing this earlier on in the lecture, we don't really want to give these traceback errors. We want to give the user at least some sort of chance of trying it again and getting it right. So we can do that with conditional. Okay. So we can use a conditional statement to include some validation, and usually that's going to be an else. So whatever we ask the user for, we check that. If it conforms to what we're expecting, we can do something with it. Else, if it doesn't, if it doesn't fit any of the conditions we want, then we can give an error message. So as a general rule, it's a good idea to have validation on the user end, but make sure that they've put something in that's going to make sense. So for that example from last week, now modified, we asked them for the maximum and minimum. Let me run the code actually. So in this week's download, run the code, ask them for minimum and maximum. If they get it wrong, if they put 10 and 1, it gives an error message, 1 is less than 10. Okay, and it's expecting the maximum to be bigger than the minimum. So there's the code. It checks using this if statement if the maximum is bigger than the minimum. If it is, then that's okay, and it will do all the calculations. Let's run it and do it correctly. Okay, and it'll do the calculations. Otherwise, what we saw is it'll give them this error message: maximum is less than minimum. That's a bit cryptic. You could be a bit more expansive about, try it again. Make sure that the first number is less than the second number. That's down to the programmer to write a useful, helpful error message rather than something that's a bit cryptic and short. Okay, so there you can see the two examples. Okay, so just to summarize today's talk, we've actually covered quite a lot. Okay, we've seen if statements, conditional statements, if, elif, and else, that we can use to handle multiple different conditions being true, with a catch-all else for if none of the conditions are true. We've seen the Boolean data type, so we can set up a variable to be true or false, depending on perhaps some input. We've seen logical operators, so or, and not. So if this is true or that is true, if this is true and that is true, and the case when if this is true and this is not true. We've seen comparison operators, so is this equal to that? Is this greater than that? Is this less than that? Okay, and we haven't seen all of them in use, but you can see how they would all work. And then we've seen a couple of other bits of stuff. So plus equals for strings to glue an extra bit of string onto the end. The in operator, the dot lower to turn an uppercase string into lowercase, or to turn any uppercase letters into lowercase, and so on. Okay, quite a lot to think about, but I think students typically find this topic fairly easy to deal with. So it's if you're finding it a bit like a lot to think about, the best thing to do is just get in there and try things out and do some examples and try to get these things to work.